In October of 1963, at a farm auction outside Clay Center, Nebraska, a 10-year-old girl paid 50 cents for a nail keg full of iron circles nobody wanted. They were seed plates, 37 of them, warped, rusted, and packed together with mouse nest, corn dust, and 2 decades of neglect. To the men standing around that truck, they looked like obsolete iron donuts from planters that belonged in the weeds. To Nora Baines, they looked like something else. They looked specific. Each plate had a different number of pockets around the rim. Some were narrow, some were deep. Some had hubs made for machines no dealer in town bothered to stock anymore. The auctioneer lifted one by 2 fingers and asked whether anybody wanted the lot. Nobody answered. Then Nora held up 2 quarters. A few men laughed, not cruelly. They laughed because a child had just spent every cent in her coat pocket on hardware that had already outlived the machines it came from. By supper, the story had reached the grain elevator. By Sunday, it had reached the church steps. Walt Baines' daughter had bought a barrel of junk. 22 years later, on a cold March morning, Nora would stand at a foreclosure auction with a checkbook in one hand and one of those same seed plates in the other. The bank would be selling the ground beside her farm, and the people who had laughed in 1963 would be too quiet to look at one another. But that morning was still a long way off. First, you have to understand what Nora's father taught her about space. Walt Baines farmed 240 acres of corn, milo, and alfalfa on ground flat enough to turn wind into a daily argument. He was not a wealthy man. He was not famous for anything. But there were 2 things everybody in Clay County knew about him. He could repair almost any machine brought through his gate, and he never signed a note he could not pay before the ink dried. His shop stood behind the farmhouse under a roof of corrugated steel. The walls were unpainted block. The floor was patched concrete. A coal stove leaned slightly toward the chimney, and the main workbench had been built from bridge timbers he bought when the county replaced a crossing in 1948. Nothing in the shop matched. The vise came from a railroad maintenance crew. The drill press came from a school shop. The lathe had no manufacturer's plate because Walt had assembled it from 2 damaged machines and made one good one. Above the bench, every hook held something with a second life. Broken cultivator shanks, bent clevises, worn bushings, chain cut into useful lengths. To Walt, a machine was not one object. It was a collection of decisions in metal. Nora began following him into the shop when she was 6. At first, he gave her simple work. Sort bolts by thread, clean grease fittings, hold the light. Then one winter evening, he set a cast iron seed plate on the bench and asked what she saw. "A wheel," she said. He shook his head. "A clock," he told her. He turned the plate slowly with one finger. Every pocket around the rim was built to carry one kernel of a certain size. Too large, and the plate picked up doubles. Too small, and it skipped. If the plate was warped, it dragged. If the edge was burred, it cracked seed. The plate did not make the corn grow. It did something quieter. It decided how the crop entered the ground. "One kernel too close steals from the next one," Walt said. "One too far away wastes what the ground could have carried." He tapped the iron with his knuckle. The whole season starts with spacing. Nora remembered that. She remembered it at the auction when she saw 37 plates in a nail keg. She remembered it when the men laughed. And after Walt helped her carry the keg into the shop, she spent the next 3 weeks cleaning every plate with kerosene, a wire brush, and old rags. Then she made cards for them. Plate diameter, hub style, pocket count, pocket depth, visible wear, likely crop, likely planter. Walt checked her work but did not correct her unless she asked. By Christmas, the keg was empty and the east wall of the shop held 37 plates, each hanging from its own nail with a handwritten tag tied through the center. The collection kept growing. Nora learned that farm auctions had a blind spot. Auctioneers knew tractors, trucks, and combines. They knew what drew a crowd, but small, obsolete parts were usually thrown together under one number and sold by the box. A bundle of planter plates might sit beside cracked lantern glass, harness buckles, and rusted cream separator parts. Most buyers saw inconvenience. Nora saw inventory. She bought plates for 10 cents, 25 cents, sometimes $1 if another farmer recognized the machine. She traded duplicates. She wrote letters to implement salvage yards. She copied seed company plate charts from old dealer books before the books were thrown away. By 16, she had more than 200 plates. By 21, she had 486, sorted by manufacturer, hub pattern, cell shape, and seed grade. Nobody at the elevator knew that. They still remembered the little girl with the keg. They did not know she had turned that laugh into a catalog. Walt died in January of 1975. He had gone into the shop before dawn to repair a frozen feed auger bearing. Nora found him beside the workbench after breakfast. The bearing was finished. The housing had been cleaned. The new seal was pressed in square. The grease gun lay beside it with the hose wiped clean. Nora noticed all of that before she let herself notice anything else. That was how Walt had trained her mind. See what is there. Name it correctly. Do not let panic do the measuring. She was 22 years old. She inherited the 240 acres, the house, the shop, 3 tractors, a 12-foot disc, a 4-row planter, and $11,800 in the county bank. There was no mortgage. There was no equipment loan. There was no operating note. There was also no father. For the first spring, Nora did only what had to be done. She planted, she cultivated, she cut hay. At night, the shop felt too quiet, so she left the radio on, even when she was not listening. Then, in April of 1976, a farmer named Ed Rolston pulled into her yard with 8 cast-iron plates wrapped in a fertilizer sack. Ed planted with an old 4-row machine his father had bought after the war. The dealer in town no longer carried plates for it. The seed company had changed kernel grades. The closest salvage yard had sent him a set that fit the shaft but not the seed. The plates picked up doubles, then skipped, then jammed. Rain was expected the next evening. Ed had 80 acres ready. The dealer's solution was a newer planter on credit. Ed did not need a newer planter. He needed 8 correct circles of iron. Nora laid his plates on the bench. She measured the hubs, counted the pockets, checked the cell depth. Then she walked to the east wall and pulled down 3 possible sets from her collection. She used a coffee scale to compare kernel weight. She hand-tested the seed through each plate, too. One set was close. Not perfect. Close enough to become perfect. The plates were true, but the cell edges had worn wide. Nora brazed the worst pockets, let the plates cool slowly in dry sand. Then dressed each cell with a file until the kernels rode cleanly without doubling. She mounted the plates on Walt's old test shaft and turned them by hand for almost an hour. 1 kernel, 1 pocket, 1 drop. By 5 in the afternoon, Ed's planter was running behind the barn. By dark, he was in the field. The rain came at 3 the next morning. His crop emerged in lines, so even that 2 neighbors stopped on the road to look. Ed returned a week later and asked what he owed. Nora said $12. He stared at her. The dealer had wanted a down payment of $640. Nora charged him $12. Ed paid $15 and told 3 other farmers. That was the beginning of the Baines plate exchange, though Nora never painted a sign. She did not need to. Farmers brought seed tags, planter numbers, bent plates, cracked hubs, and coffee cans full of hardware. Nora matched what could be matched. She repaired what could be repaired. She refused what was too far gone. That refusal mattered. A man could argue with a dealer. He could not argue with Nora after she set a plate on the bench and showed him a hairline crack running through the hub. That one breaks in the field, she would say, and then $12 becomes a day. She rented full sets for $3 a row. She sold restored plates for $5 to $8 each. She kept records of every machine, every seed grade, and every season. Within 3 years, she had working plate sets for 41 planter models that local dealers no longer supported. Her total cash investment was smaller than what some men spent on a single tractor tire. A used arbor press cost $35. A precision caliper cost $18. A brazing torch and regulators cost $42. A box of files, gauges, and marking stamps cost $21.40. She spent another $14 on shelving and tags. Total, $130.40. Plus the 50 cents she had spent at the auction in 1963. $130.90. By 1979, the exchange served 67 farms in 5 counties. Some years, Nora handled more than 600 plates before planting season. The work did not make her rich all at once. That was not its value. It brought money in when farm expenses were highest. It required almost no borrowed capital, and every plate she added made the collection more useful than it had been before. A single odd plate might wait 7 years for the right farmer. Then, on the exact morning someone needed it, that plate could save an entire planting window. Nora understood that waiting did not make an asset useless. Sometimes waiting was what gave it value. The late 1970s did not reward that kind of thinking. They rewarded size. Corn prices were strong. Land values climbed. Banks called expansion planning. Implement dealers called it modernization. Farm magazines printed photographs of 12-row planters, air-conditioned cabs, and combines wide enough to make a small field look temporary. Men who had farmed 300 acres borrowed to farm 600. Men who owned one good tractor bought 2 bigger ones. A machine still under warranty became a symbol of seriousness. A paid-off machine became evidence that a man had fallen behind. Nora watched the county change. She bought one used tractor in 1978 and paid cash. She rebuilt the hydraulic pump herself. She kept her 4-row planter. She kept the plate exchange. She kept the 240 acres. At the bank, a loan officer once suggested she open a line of credit in case an opportunity appeared. Nora asked what the line would cost if she did not use it. He gave her a number. She asked what it would cost if she did. He gave her another number. She thanked him and left. That evening, she wrote both numbers in a ledger. Beside them, she wrote something Walt had said about seed. Never fill tomorrow's row before you reach it. That sentence became the rule of the farm. Not because Nora feared growth, because she understood spacing. A crop planted too close can look impressive for a month. Then the roots begin fighting underground. Crowding does not reveal its cost at emergence. It reveals it when the weather turns, and the weather turned. By 1981, interest rates had climbed high enough to make ordinary operating notes feel like punishment. Commodity prices weakened. Fuel stayed expensive. Land that had been valued by optimism was suddenly valued by what it could actually produce. In Clay County, the math failed first on paper. Then it failed in kitchens. Then it failed at courthouse doors. A farmer would miss a payment. The bank would extend the note. A second year would disappoint. The equipment would be appraised for less than the balance. The land would be appraised for less than the mortgage. And a family that had looked prosperous from the road would discover that every visible thing in the yard belonged partly to someone else. 11 farms in Nora's part of the county changed hands between 1982 and 1986. 3 went through sheriff's sale. 2 families left the state. One man parked his combine behind the machine shed so he would not have to watch it loaded onto the dealer's truck. Ed Rolston held on longer than most. He was a careful farmer. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He kept clean books. But in 1978, he had borrowed against his 120 acres to buy a larger combine and rent more ground. The numbers had worked when corn was strong and money was cheap. By 1984, neither was true. The combine payment did not care what corn was worth. The bank did not care that the rain had stopped in July. Ed sold the rented ground first, then cattle, then a truck. It was not enough. The notice went up in February of 1985. 120 acres beside the Baines farm would be sold at foreclosure auction. That land had touched Nora's east fence since she was born. Walt had helped tile the wet corner in 1956. Nora had fixed Ed's planter plates in 1976 so he could seed it before the rain. Now the bank was selling it by the acre. The night before the auction, Nora sat alone in the shop. On the east wall hung more than 700 seed plates. Some were clean black iron. Some showed bright file marks. Some still carried old paint from companies that no longer existed. She took down the first plate from the keg. It was too worn to use. The hub was chipped. One cell had broken through. She had kept it anyway. Not as inventory, as evidence. She turned it in her hands and thought about all the seasons that had passed since 50 cents bought the lot. 22 planting seasons. Hundreds of repaired sets. Thousands of acres seeded by machines that dealers had declared obsolete. Money earned in $5 and $12 pieces. No single payment large enough to impress anyone. Together, enough to matter. Her bank balance was $52,600. The land would not be cheap, but it would be real, and it would be beside her. At the auction the next morning, the wind came out of the north, hard enough to slap the paper tags against the fence posts. The bank set the opening bid at $300 an acre. A farm investor from Lincoln opened. A cattleman from the next county raised him. The price moved through $320, $340, $350. At $360, the cattleman stopped. The investor looked around the crowd, satisfied that the field had narrowed to one. Nora raised her hand. $365. The auctioneer turned. Until that moment, several men had not realized she was bidding. The investor studied her for a few seconds. Then he said $370. Nora said $375. The investor folded his sale bill once, then again. He put it into his coat pocket and shook his head. The auctioneer asked for $380. No one answered. He asked again. The only sound was wind pushing through dry weeds along the ditch. Sold. 120 acres. $375 an acre. $45,000. Nora signed the papers on the hood of the clerk's car. Then she wrote the check. The crowd did not laugh. They watched the pen move. Ed stood near the gate with both hands in his coat pockets. When Nora finished, he walked over for a moment. Neither of them spoke. Then Ed looked toward the field. "I thought I had more time," he said. Nora nodded. Most people did. He looked at the checkbook in her hand. "How long were you planning to buy that ground?" Nora glanced toward the east fence, the shop roof visible beyond it. "Since before either of us knew it would be for sale." Ed gave a tired laugh, not because it was funny, because he understood. The plan had not begun with the auction. It had begun with a child recognizing that obsolete did not mean worthless. It had continued through every plate cleaned, every dollar kept, every loan refused, and every season in which Nora left enough room for the next one. She did not celebrate the purchase. There was no victory dinner, no speech. She drove home, hung the broken plate back on its nail, and went to feed the cattle. Spring was 6 weeks away. The new ground needed work. That was enough. Nora farmed 360 paid-off acres for the next 23 years. She kept the plate exchange through the early 1990s, even as newer planters replaced most of the machines she served. By then, the work had changed. Collectors called. Small farmers called. Men restoring their father's equipment called from states Nora had never visited. She mailed plates in wooden boxes with handwritten notes explaining seed size, cell count, and what to check before planting. She never called the collection rare. She called it useful. In 1998, the county co-op asked Nora to speak at its winter meeting. She stood behind a folding lectern in a room that smelled like coffee, wet coats, and fertilizer dust. She brought one object with her, the broken seed plate from the original keg. She held it up. "Most people think this is about saving old iron," she said. "It isn't." She turned the plate so the room could see the pockets around the edge. "This plate cannot grow corn. It cannot make rain. It cannot protect a price. It does one thing. It gives each seed the right amount of room." She set the plate on the lectern. "My father taught me that spacing decides what a field can survive." Then she looked at the men in front of her. "The same is true of money. A payment is a seed you have already planted in a season that has not arrived. Plant too many of them, and tomorrow has no room left." No one moved. Nora was not accusing them. That made the words harder to avoid. She continued, "I watched good farmers lose good ground, not because they were lazy. Not because they were foolish. Because every strong year convinced them the next one had already been earned." She rested one hand on the iron plate. "I was lucky. I had a father who made me leave space." Then she stepped away. That was the entire speech. Ed Ralston sat in the second row. He had kept farming rented ground after the foreclosure. His operation was smaller. His back was bent. His attention was not. When Nora returned to her seat, he reached over and touched the edge of the broken plate. "Still no good for planting," he said. Nora looked at it. "No," she said. "Still good for remembering." In 2003, Nora's niece June began spending summers at the farm. June liked the shop more than the house. By 13, she could identify most plate families by hub shape. By 15, she could true a warped plate on the arbor without shaving too much from the edge. Nora taught her the same way Walt had taught Nora. Show the object, name the job, let patience finish the lesson. When June took over the farm, the east wall still held the plates, more than 900 by then. The original 37 were marked with a small white dot. Not because they were the most valuable, because they were the beginning. The people at that auction in 1963 thought Nora Baines had paid 50 cents for a keg of obsolete iron. What she actually bought was a way of seeing. A seed plate looks simple until you understand that an entire field begins by passing through its smallest spaces. A debt looks manageable until you understand that it also occupies space in a season that has not happened yet. The county spent years mistaking expansion for strength, because expansion was easy to see. Nora's strength was harder to see. It hung quietly on a shop wall. It accumulated $5 at a time. It waited. And when the weather turned, when the prices fell, and when the bank began selling tomorrow to pay for yesterday, Nora still had room in the row.